One experience while I was on LAPON, we were coming in for a moor in Naples, and in Naples a lot of times the submarines would actually anchor outside of the molo in Naples, and so we had secured the maneuvering watch at that particular point, but you maintained an officer on the bridge as officer of the deck to make sure that your anchor had actually taken on the bottom, and that you weren't either drifting or in a situation where you were potentially at risk of running into the transit lanes. So we had a navigation team below decks, and I was, of course, trying to do visual piloting, visual confirmation that we were in the right position, but an awful lot of times what you have to do is you have to plot that on an actual navigation chart and make sure that you're not drifting. Well, it turns out that the quartermaster had identified that in fact we were drifting, and I was seeing that we were getting closer and closer to the molo. So this was the first time as an officer of the deck, and it was a relatively junior officer of the deck at that particular point. Hadn't had a lot of watch standing under my belt. So the way that you typically would get the captain's attention if you needed his support in making a decision on what you should do is that you'd pick up the phone and call him. But if in this kind of a case it was getting to the point where we needed to do some other action, so I had to go on the announcing system and say, "Captain to the bridge," and he came up, and then we got the main engines going, and we had to reposition the ship and then put the anchor down again to make sure that we were in fact solidly connected via the anchor to the bottom, as opposed to just pulling the anchor with the ship's movement. So that was kind of an interesting and somewhat challenging activity, because I didn't want my first watch in that particular situation to be where we ended up coming into contact with the rocks in Naples Harbor. So it was kind of an interesting experience. Subsequent to the completion of my duties on LAPON, the final qualification that I accomplished when I was there was certification by the Naval Reactors Organization as qualified to be an engineer officer on a nuclear powered vessel. This was a process that Naval Reactors had established, that each officer who was going to go and be a department head on a nuclear submarine had to be certified as an engineer officer, which is an additional qualification beyond your initial training for nuclear. To have this particular additional certification, so you go through some additional academic training, and then you have to go to Naval Reactors. You take an exam that lasts most of the day, and then you have interviews by members of the nuclear reactor staff to certify that you have adequate knowledge to be able to be an engineer officer on a nuclear ship. Wow. And that particular program continues to today. In fact, there is still that process that goes on for individuals who go through their training program. So my next assignment was for 2 years as a company officer at the Naval Academy. It was my first chance after completion of 3 years of sea duty to have a shore duty assignment, and the responsibility of the company officers is to be the commissioned officer who's responsible for one of the 36 companies at that time of midshipmen who's going through their training. Okay. So the midshipmen are responsible for the operation of the brigade, but the commissioned officers are really the people who are responsible for the discipline and to ensure that all of the requirements for leadership are met by those people going through the Naval Academy. So I was the first company officer, and I was there from the summer of '73 through the summer of '75. Okay. One of the individuals who was in my company graduated in 1974 was a rear admiral who ultimately became a rear admiral named Ben Wackendorf. And it was interesting because Wackendorf graduated in '74, and ultimately in 1988 he relieved me in command of the USS Park. Somebody who was a midshipman in your company ultimately came back and relieved you in command of a nuclear submarine. So was kind of a small. It was also interesting because the first company officer who succeeded me, although we didn't have a contact relief, but he came in August of '75, and I left in June of '75 to go to my next assignment, was Mike Mullen, who is now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a classmate of mine at the Naval. Another one of those small world stories. Yeah. The 2 years at the Naval Academy was enjoyable, rewarding, and gave me a chance to understand a little bit about the additional process that people go through to get prepared to get a commission in the Navy. In '75, I went off to 6-month school at Submarine School, which was our department head school called Submarine Officer Advanced Course, and I did that in Groton, Connecticut.